What if I told you there's a powder that does two things at the exact same time, two things that sound like they shouldn't belong in the same product at all? First, it feeds your grass real nitrogen, the same nutrient sitting in every bag of lawn food at the hardware store. Your grass drinks it in and answers with darker green, thicker blades, a stronger stand, the kind of visible response you'd expect from a genuine, high quality lawn food. Second, at the exact same time in the exact same soil, it starves weeds before they're ever born, not by burning them, not by poisoning the ground. It lets a weed seed sprout normally, lets it push its first thread of root down into the soil the way it always has, and then it stops that root from developing any further. The seedling has nothing to drink through, nothing to feed itself with, and it dies quietly underground before it ever breaks the surface where you'd see it. Meanwhile, your grass, which already has an established root system doing its job, just sits there getting fed, getting stronger, getting thicker, filling in every gap a weed might have tried to reach. Feed grass, starve weeds. Same cup, same soil, same hour, completely opposite results. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something made up to keep you watching, a contradiction designed to grab your attention rather than describe anything real. But before I tell you exactly what's in the cup, I need to correct something the title itself gets slightly wrong, because I'd rather you know that now than waste a bag finding out yourself the hard way. The honest correction. What every weed actually means. This mechanism is real and it's genuinely well documented, but it doesn't touch every single weed in your yard, and pretending otherwise would set you up to feel disappointed by something that's actually working exactly as designed and intended. It's most effective against small-seeded annual weeds, crabgrass, goosegrass, foxtail, the kind whose tiny seeds are especially vulnerable to having their root formation interrupted. It does nothing at all to weeds that are already established with mature root systems, since those roots already exist and there's nothing left to interrupt. And it does nothing to weeds that spread by underground runners instead of seeds, things like creeping Charlie, ground ivy, or Bermuda grass creeping in from a neighbor's yard, because those plants don't need a germinating seed to expand at all. They just crawl sideways underground. It's also noticeably weaker against large-seeded weeds like dandelion, whose bigger, more resilient seeds don't respond to root inhibition nearly as reliably as a tiny crabgrass seed does. This doesn't attack a weed the way a herbicide does. It removes the one thing a newborn weed can't possibly live without. That's a very different kind of weed control, and it has a very specific, narrow target, not a universal one covering every plant, once you know exactly what it truly can and can't do. Honestly, the next question worth asking is where this thing even came from in the first place, because the origin story genuinely matters here. The accidental discovery, 1986. This product was discovered by accident at Iowa State University in the mid 1980s by a turfgrass researcher named Nick Christians. He wasn't looking for a weed killer at all. He was studying disease prevention in golf course turf, and he was using a cheap, common corn byproduct as part of his growing medium for the experiment. Something readily available and unglamorous, the kind of material nobody would have expected to matter beyond its role as filler. What he noticed was strange enough that most researchers would have written it off as a ruined trial and simply started over. In the plots where he'd spread this byproduct, the grass seed he'd planted wasn't rooting properly, and the surrounding weeds weren't establishing either. Instead of dismissing the failure and moving on, he got curious about why his experiment had produced this unexpected result. He spent years chasing that question, running trial after trial, and what he eventually found changed lawn care. Hiding inside the protein of that corn byproduct were naturally occurring compounds that reach into a germinating seed and stop it from forming a root. Not the leaf, not the stem, specifically the root, the one structure every germinating seed depends on completely. In 1991, Iowa State was granted a patent on it as a natural pre-emergent herbicide, one of the first genuinely organic weed preventers a university had ever put its name behind, and the whole discovery came out. It looked it up. Once you know what he actually found, the exact name of the product matters more than you'd think, because one wrong word on the bag means you've bought something completely different and we'll see none of these results. Product identity, not cornmeal, not cornstarch. The powder is corn gluten meal, not cornmeal, not cornstarch, not corn flour, not cracked corn from the feed store. They sound like cousins, close enough in name to cause genuine confusion at the store. They are not the same thing at all. Corn gluten meal is a specific byproduct of the corn wet milling process. When corn is processed to extract its starch and sweeteners, the protein portion gets separated out and dried into a yellow powder, and that powder is corn gluten meal. It contains roughly 10% nitrogen by weight, which makes it a legitimate fertilizer entirely on its own, but it also carries the specific proteins responsible for stopping root formation in germinating seeds. Regular cornmeal from the grocery store is mostly starch by comparison. There simply isn't enough of the active protein in it to stop anything from doing anything at all. If you buy plain cornmeal thinking it's a cheaper version of the same product, spread it and see no results whatsoever, that's exactly why. Read the label carefully before you buy. It has to say corn gluten meal specifically, spelled out, and it should list a nitrogen content somewhere around 9 to 10%. If the bag doesn't say gluten anywhere on it, put it back on the shelf and keep looking. Now here's where the title's 1 cup actually becomes useful, not as a vague measurement, but as something you can genuinely apply today on a specific patch of ground. The 1 cup conversion, small scale. In kitchen terms, 1 level cup of corn gluten meal weighs about a third of a pound, and it treats roughly 16 square feet, a patch about 4 feet by 4 feet, small enough to picture clearly and measure without any special equipment. Picture that. A raised bed, a rose border, the strip along the driveway where crabgrass sets up camp every June, the bare corner by the mailbox. For spots like that, you don't need a spreader at all. You need a cup and about 5 minutes. For a full lawn rather than a small patch, the actual research rate from Iowa State is 20 pounds of corn gluten meal per 1,000 square feet of turf. That's the amount that delivers both the root-stopping activity and a meaningful dose of nitrogen at the same time. A standard 25-pound bag covers about 1,200 square feet, which handles most front yards on its own, maybe 2 bags if you're doing the whole property. Use a broadcast spreader set to a medium rate and walk it in 2 perpendicular passes, north to south, then east to west, for even coverage instead of heavy strips with thin gaps between them. Don't try to save money by applying less than the recommended rate. At lower rates, you still get the fertilizer effect, but not enough of the root-stopping activity to actually matter, and you end up feeding the very weeds you were trying to prevent. Get the amount right and precise, and you're still only halfway there because timing decides whether any of this actually works at all, regardless of how carefully you measured the timing rule. Before the seed, germinate. This is a pre-emergent. Before. It has to go down before weed seeds germinate, not after you see them poking through the ground where they're already visible. It does nothing to seeds that haven't yet begun their root formation, in the sense that it needs to already be present in the soil waiting for them, and it does nothing at all to weeds that already have established roots holding them in place. For spring application, targeting summer weeds like crabgrass and goosegrass apply when soil temperature reaches about 55 degrees Fahrenheit at a depth of 4 inches. You can buy a soil thermometer for a few dollars if you want precision, and don't mind checking it daily. Or you can watch the forsythia bushes instead, those scraggly plants that push out bright yellow flowers on bare branches before almost anything else greens up in the neighborhood. When forsythia blooms, your soil is right around 55 degrees, and you've got roughly a 2-week window before crabgrass germinates. A reliable natural signal that doesn't require any equipment at all. If you're growing a warm season lawn further south, Bermuda, Zoysia, St. Augustine, centipede, watch the redbud trees instead of forsythia, and apply about 2 weeks earlier than the timing used further north, since warm season grasses and their associated weeds wake up earlier in the year. For fall application, targeting winter weeds like henbit, chickweed, and annual bluegrass, apply in late August or early September, before the first cool nights of the season trigger fall germination in those species. You have to arrive before the party starts, And the whole art of this is knowing exactly when the party starts. It's not guessing based on the calendar hanging in your garage. Get the calendar right. And there's still one important mistake that can flip this entire product against you within just a few days of applying it, turning a genuine pre-emergent into an accidental weed fertilizer. The watering rule, the mistake that fertilizes your weeds after you apply corn gluten meal. It needs a light watering within 24 hours, either from a hose or a light rain, to activate the root-inhibiting compounds in the powder and carry them down to where the seeds are waking up. But after that initial activation, the ground needs to stay dry for 4 to 5 consecutive days. No rain, no irrigation, nothing at all touching that soil. Here's why that matters so much, and it's not what most people assume. Corn gluten meal is 10% nitrogen. It's fertilizer, plain and simple. If the soil stays wet after that first activating watering, the nitrogen dissolves into the ground and feeds growing in it, including the weed seeds you're actively trying to stop. You will have fertilized your weeds instead of starving them. They'll come up faster and stronger than if you'd applied nothing to that patch of ground at all. So check the weather forecast carefully before you even buy the bag. What you want is one day of light rain or a light watering you control yourself, followed by 4 to 5 genuinely dry days in a row. If a week of heavy rain is in the forecast, wait for a better window rather than applying on a bad one and blaming the product afterward. The powder doesn't kill the weed. The dry days do. The powder only opens the door and steps back. And there's a second, quieter mistake almost nobody talks about. One that has nothing to do with the weather at all, and it catches even people who got the timing perfectly right. The overfeeding math. Don't add more fertilizer. Do the arithmetic with me for a moment. It only takes a few seconds and it's worth understanding clearly. 20 pounds of corn gluten meal at 10% nitrogen works out to 2 full pounds of actual nitrogen across 1,000 square feet. The standard recommendation for feeding an average lawn is roughly 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per single feeding. So that cup isn't a light snack for your grass at all. It's already a double feeding on its own, delivering twice the standard rate in one application. Here's what happens in yards all over the country every spring because of this. Someone spreads their corn gluten meal on a Saturday, and then, because it's spring and that's simply what people do in spring, they go back out the next day with a separate bag of lawn fertilizer or a weed and feed product that already has its own nitrogen mixed in. That lawn has now been fed 3 or 4 times what it can actually use. That doesn't make grass stronger. It makes it grow fast and soft, long, tender blades that flop over, catch disease more easily, and scorch the moment real heat arrives. The extra nitrogen that the grass can't absorb just washes down and out into the storm drain. If you use the cup, you do not fertilize separately. The cup is the fertilizer. That's the whole rule. Now, what about the weeds already standing in your yard right now? Because this product was never built to handle those. What it can't do? Establish weeds, and Runner's corn gluten meal does nothing to weeds that are already established with mature root systems already holding them firmly in place. Those roots already exist, fully formed, and the root-inhibiting compounds simply have nothing left to interrupt at that stage. For dandelions and clover already standing in your lawn today, you need a different tool entirely. Something like ferrous sulfate, applied separately, that kills established broadleaf weeds directly through contact rather than by preventing germination. It also does nothing at all against weeds that spread by underground runners rather than seeds. Creeping Charlie, ground ivy, and Bermuda grass invading from a neighbor's yard all fall squarely into this category. Those plants don't need a germinating seed to expand across your lawn at all. They simply send stems sideways through the soil and surface wherever conditions allow, which means a product built specifically to interrupt seed germination has essentially no effect on them whatsoever, no matter how correctly you apply it. And as mentioned earlier, it's noticeably less effective against large-seeded weeds like dandelion compared to small-seeded ones like crabgrass, so don't expect the same dramatic percentage reduction on those even with perfect timing. And there's one more situation where this product doesn't just fail quietly, it can actually make your weed problem worse. Warning. This is the mistake I see even experienced gardeners make, and it's an easy one to fall into precisely because the product feels so harmless. Corn gluten meal only feeds what already has established roots to feed. That's its entire nature, its whole mechanism, and there's no way around it. So if a meaningful portion of your lawn is bare, open soil rather than living turf, there's nothing there for it to feed, and you've simply spread 10% nitrogen across empty ground, which happens to be exactly where weed seeds thrive best once they arrive. Spreading a pre-emergent across a thin, patchy lawn is effectively pouring fertilizer onto dirt and hoping for the best outcome. Be honest with yourself about what you're actually looking at before you buy a bag. If your lawn is reasonably full, maybe thin in a few scattered places, but generally green and closed, this product is genuinely well suited for you. If it's significantly bare and struggling in large sections, fill the ground first with grass seed instead, and let this wait a full season before you introduce it. You'll get a better long-term result more slowly than a worse result, quickly by rushing the order of operations, with the limits and the warnings both covered honestly. Here's what the actual research says happens when this is used correctly, year over year, across a real lawn, DOF80, before the trial data, 2 quick safety points worth knowing up front. This material is food grade in origin. It's been used as animal feed for generations, fed to hogs and poultry, long before anyone thought to put it on a lawn at all. That means once it's watered in and settled into the soil, there's no toxic residue left sitting there, and no waiting period required before kids or pets can use the lawn again. Unlike many synthetic pre-emergent products that explicitly require keeping people and animals off treated areas for a set number of hours after application. And if anyone in your household manages a gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, it's genuinely worth knowing that corn gluten and wheat gluten are chemically distinct proteins entirely, despite sharing part of a name. Corn gluten meal is not the same substance and doesn't carry the same concern at all. Real trial data, what the research actually shows. This isn't a theory or a marketing claim dressed up to scientific. It's peer-reviewed science, published by Iowa State, Purdue, Oregon State, and other land-grant institutions confirming that corn gluten meal functions as a genuine pre-emergent herbicide with a real documented mechanism. Iowa State's own guidance and trial data show that results tend to improve across multiple seasons of consistent use rather than delivering a dramatic result in the very first year, and that heavy rain or irrigation shortly after application measurably reduces effectiveness, which lines up exactly with the watering rule covered earlier in this video. It's worth being straightforward about something else too, because I'd rather you hear the complete picture than just the flattering half of it. Separate field research, including work done at Washington State University, looking at real yards under real, variable weather conditions rather than controlled greenhouse settings, has found that weed control results out in actual lawns don't always match the more dramatic numbers seen in tightly controlled trials. Real soil, real weather, and real inconsistent application technique all introduce variables a research plot doesn't have to deal with. What stayed consistent across both settings, though, was the turf response. The nitrogen benefit and the resulting thicker, greener grass showed up reliably no matter the setting, controlled or not. So the honest picture is this. The fertilizing effect is dependable and consistent. The weed prevention effect is real, but variable, strongest with correct timing and correct dry weather follow-through, and it compounds the longer and more consistently you use it. That's the research. Here's what that actually looks like across 3 real years on 1 real lawn, following the method exactly as described. The 3-year case in year 1, a spring application timed to the forsythia bloom, typically produces a real but modest result, commonly cited around a 40 to 50% reduction in crabgrass compared to an untreated year. That's genuinely useful, but it's not the dramatic transformation the marketing around this product sometimes implies, and it's worth setting that expectation honestly up front. Dandelions usually still show up in year 1, since they were already established before you ever applied anything, and this product never touches established plants regardless of how correctly you apply it they need to be handled separately with a different tool entirely. A fall application that same first year, targeting henbit and chickweed, often shows a somewhat stronger reduction, commonly around 60%, simply because those particular weeds respond a bit more consistently to the mechanism. By year 2, with consistent spring and fall applications completed correctly, the improvement compounds noticeably, often reaching something like an 80% reduction in crabgrass compared to year 1's baseline. Part of that jump comes from the pre-emergent effect itself, getting a full second season to work. And part of it comes from the lawn having now received 2 full seasons of extra nitrogen feeding, making it visibly thicker with noticeably less bare soil available for anything else to colonize in the first place. The two effects are already beginning to multiply each other by this point, exactly as the mechanism predicts. By year 3, many users following the correct rate and timing report crabgrass reduced to just a handful of individual plants across an entire lawn that previously had hundreds scattered throughout it. The turf itself has become thick enough by this point that even without the pre-emergent effect doing any of the work, weeds simply struggle to find bare, open ground to land on and establish in the first place. This is the key mechanism worth understanding clearly, because it explains why patience matters so much here. Each application does two things simultaneously. It prevents that particular season's germinating weeds from ever forming roots, and it feeds the existing grass nitrogen that makes it measurably thicker. Thicker grass means less exposed bare soil. Less bare soil means fewer opportunities for new weed seeds to ever reach the ground and germinate at all. The pre-emergent effect and the fertilizer effect multiply each other year over year, compounding rather than simply repeating the same result annually. This gets more effective over time, not less, which is exactly the opposite of how most synthetic weed programs behave, since those rely on repeating the identical treatment every year without the underlying soil or turf ever actually improving. Cost comparison. 2 applications a year, spring and fall, at the recommended 20-pound rate, typically runs somewhere around $30 to $40 annually for an average lawn, covering both bags of material and requiring nothing beyond a broadcast spreader you likely already own. Compare that to a professional lawn service running 4 applications per year of synthetic pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides, commonly $600 to $1,200 annually, depending on lawn size and region, plus the inconvenience of scheduling appointments and being home for the service truck. Those synthetic programs also tend to leave the underlying soil no better off year after year, meaning the same cost repeats indefinitely because the turf itself never gets thick enough to start doing any of the work on its own. Corn gluten meal, by contrast, is genuinely a long game that requires 2 to 3 seasons of patience before you see the full compounding result described earlier, but the annual cost actually tends to decrease over time as the lawn thickens and needs progressively less product to maintain the same level of control. Ending. So here's the honest version of the title, not the exaggerated one designed purely to get a click. 1 cup of corn gluten meal really does feed established grass with real nitrogen, while simultaneously blocking small-seeded annual weeds like crabgrass from ever forming a root, provided you apply it at the right soil temperature, water it in correctly to activate it, and then give it the dry days it genuinely needs to actually work as designed. It doesn't touch weeds already established in your lawn today. It doesn't do anything at all against weeds that spread by underground runners, and it won't fix a lawn that's mostly bare, open soil no matter how much of it you apply. Get the timing, the rate, and the follow-through right, and it compounds year after year into a lawn that increasingly protects itself without needing more product every single season. Tell me in the comments what your biggest weed problem is right now: crabgrass, dandelions, creeping Charlie, something else entirely, and whether you've tried corn gluten meal before and gotten the timing wrong somewhere along the way. I read every comment, and the pattern in your answers genuinely tells me exactly what to cover next on this channel. And if you want more of this, real mechanisms explained honestly, real research cited by name and institution, claims corrected, instead of just repeated because they sound good, hit subscribe. Video here builds on the last one instead of simply repeating whatever happened to perform well somewhere else on this platform.